Good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Turner and welcome to our September Lunchtime Seminar. Our Lunchtime Seminars run most months and they remain one of the Risk New Zealand's most popular events, so thanks for joining. I would like to thank and acknowledge the support of Risk New Zealand's partners who really make this possible. The first one is our premier sponsor, Marsh. Our key Lunchtime Seminar sponsors are Safety Associates and SAI Global. Our Lunchtime Seminar supporters are KPMG, Navigatus, Christchurch City Council, PowerCo and Watercare. So thank you very much. Today's Risk New Zealand Lunchtime Seminar is being via webinar only. I ask that everybody keep themselves on mute, but please feel free to type questions straight into the webinar platform anytime during the session. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to really get those questions together. So now on to today's topic, the way sustainability is changing our industry. So it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Olivia Philpott. Olivia Philpott is the sustainability lead for the Central Interceptor Project at Watercare. Her role includes working with their contractor to implement the ISCA Infrastructure Sustainability framework while integrating sustainability into BAU processes and decision-making both on site and strategically. So please, Olivia, take it away.
Hi there, thank you for that intro, David. Hello, welcome. It's quite funny being on a webinar because you're talking to these people, but you have no idea who's there or how many people. But I'm really glad to be sharing sustainability with you today. So as David said, I'm the sustainability lead on the Central Interceptor Project with Watercare. And just a very brief bit of background on what that project is for anyone who isn't in the know about it. So it's that's actually a little bit of outdated info there. We need to update our comms because we've just received consent to extend the tunnel. But it's a 14.7 kilometre wastewater and stormwater combined tunnel, and it runs from Western Springs and Greylin in the north through the middle of town, effectively, the Central Isthmus, down to the Mangere wastewater treatment plant, and it goes under the Manukau Harbour here. So it's 14.7 metres long, kilometres long, and 4.5 metres wide. And so it's kind of got a few different purposes. One of the big ones is to reduce the combined wastewater stormwater overflows that we have a lot of in the city. It's also going to increase network efficiencies. For example, all of the wastewater at the moment from the Ponsonby area, for example, it flows all the way around the waterfront, around Mission Bay area, and then cuts across Auckland down here. So it's incredibly inefficient, and as the wastewater is flowing through these sewers, it's degrading them very slowly, but over time you're getting more wear and tear of these sewers because they're being used, and we're getting things like fugitive greenhouse gas emissions because things are going in the wrong direction. So this will make things a lot more efficient. On top of that, we're also replicating aging infrastructure. So the section here under the Manukau Harbour, that's a very old pipe, and it's one that's kind of vital or essential. So they can't turn it off to do maintenance. It's in 100% of the time it's in service. So there's no way of knowing what condition it's in exactly. And so the Central Interceptor will actually replicate that so that we can take that other one offline and inspect its condition. Because it was built in, I think, the 1960s, we're kind of expecting that it is a little bit old, and that's why we need to replicate it, because there is risk of it failing, and therefore you'd have untreated wastewater flowing into the harbour, which is definitely not what we want to be happening. And we're also providing for growth. So it's such a huge tunnel that it's going to provide a lot of capacity for growth, both in the wastewater and stormwater space. So I wanted to just kind of do a very general what is sustainability piece, because it seems like, you know, is it about trees? Is it climate change? It's quite a broad thing. And so bringing it into the corporate and infrastructure world, I kind of like to see it as doing more with less. So building for tomorrow, but with less emissions, resources, water, everything like that than we needed to do it with previously. And so a lot of sustainability professionals take an approach of a four-prong approach effectively, so environmental, economic, cultural and social lenses. And so when you're making a decision, you consider all of those factors, both in terms of risk and opportunity. And in theory, you should be adding value rather than cost. So sustainability, when done right, is actually about money savings. So, you know, you use less fuel, less materials, you're more efficient. So you should be then seeing cost savings. It's not always the case, and I have to admit I'm not the best at that in some cases. I've had some experiences where I have ended up spending quite a bit to try and get the right outcomes, particularly in the social and ecology spaces, but sometimes that's the right thing to do, and it's not, you know, that bottom line isn't just always about cost, it's about the other capital, so natural capital, social capital, things like that. In Australia particularly, sustainability is being brought into legislation, especially at that state level, which we don't have. So some states, I know Queensland and I think New South Wales as well, are actually mandating infrastructure projects to get sustainability ratings on their project, which is quite interesting that it's, you know, it's in the law, and it's potentially something that we could see coming over here at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps. I think it's pretty likely. I don't think we're ready for it yet in terms of what our industry is prepared for. But one thing that we are trying to prepare for, particularly I've noticed in the public sector, is we are starting to put sustainability requirements into our infrastructure contracts. So between Central Interceptor, CRL, the Scott Point Sports Park by Auckland Council, I know these are all Auckland-centric examples, and I apologise for that. That's kind of the space that I'm playing in at the moment. But you are seeing a lot of these infrastructure projects mandating infrastructure sustainability in the contract. And I know there's quite a bit of work being done in Christchurch Council as well. I think it's Christchurch City Council are doing a lot of work with ISCA. So it's certainly becoming quite widespread, and I'm quite excited to see the public sector taking some leadership on that approach. And in terms of projects like the CI or the City Rail Link, you do have an opportunity for impact because we've got big projects, they're big scale, big budget. So you have an opportunity to take some of these smaller risks and start piloting change, and you know, other projects are able to follow suit perhaps once those things have been proven to be effective. So a couple of points on the environmental impacts of infrastructure, which is, as I say, that's my real remit, is sustainability within infrastructure projects. So climate change is obviously a huge one. Our New Zealand's energy profile has industry as the third biggest source of emissions, following agriculture and energy. And of course, infrastructure uses a lot of energy as well, you know, electricity and fuel and everything. So it's a huge part of what we do is climate related. And then also waste. So 17% of New Zealand's waste comes from construction and demo. So that's actually a huge pocket when you think about other sources of wastes like food waste, general household waste, generally biosolids for Watercare, that's a big source of waste. So construction is definitely a big one. And the thing is it's not easy, but there's definitely avenues available to us to better address that waste and look at reusing it or recycling it, rather than just sending it straight to landfill. So that's a big priority for the CI project and sustainability in general. And then pressure on resources. So we're looking quite heavily at resources, so water, energy, materials, you know, concrete, steel, aggregate, timber, all of these things that we're extracting to build our projects. How can we make sure that A, we're using them efficiently as possible to make sure that we're not being wasteful or overusing them? And B, how can we take those materials and look at how they're made or what they're made of, what's their supply chain, to ensure that we're getting the best materials as possible in terms of sustainability. So that might be looking at lower carbon cement that can go into your concrete, because cement is a hugely high greenhouse gas emitter. Things like that. And then ecological value and also connectivity. So a lot of our projects have a goal to blank reinstate, make sure you've gotten it back up to the ecological value that the site was at previously. So for a lot of our projects, we do them on fields that might be closed landfills, so regrassing them, making sure that they're back to the state they were in previous. But with sustainability, it's actually about going beyond that. So how can we improve the ecological value? How can we improve biodiversity or pest, plant and animal species control? How can we improve connectivity for birds and lizards and eels and everything that we have in our natural environment? Those are some of the big focuses for us. So ISCA, this is something that has become really widespread in Australia, and we're only really just seeing a couple of projects in New Zealand start to pick up on it. But effectively, it's an independent rating system, so similar to Green Roads or Green Star, those kind of sustainability ratings, but for infrastructure rather than buildings or roads. So it encompasses all of these different images that you've got here, so water and waste, and rail is a hugely widespread one. Sadly, I haven't seen a huge uptake of it in Australia in the water industry. There's 3 or 4 treatment plants, but there's no pipelines that I know of. It's hugely well done in rail and road, so I'm really passionate about seeing how water-related projects can start to pick up on this kind of thing. So a little bit of background about ISCA, as I said. So it says Australia, they're actually looking to convert that to Australasia to make it more relevant, because they're starting to break into the New Zealand market. But it's an equivalent to Sequel in the UK. And so it's a New Zealand and Australia specific rating tool that was born from the Australian Green Infrastructure Council. As I said, they're pretty widespread. They've got $80 billion worth of projects already engaged in the rating. And so where the CI is at, we've just had our design rating verified, and we got the top tier sustainability rating. So we're really proud of that. And now we're moving into the as-built space. So effectively proving that we are implementing all of these great sustainability initiatives we came up with in the design. And you can also get ratings for operational assets. So anything that you run day to day, you can get ratings on. And that's what the Auckland Airport did. And so these are the 6 projects on ISCA's website that have ratings. CI isn't on there yet. I've been pushing to try and get them to get it up on their website, because we've only just reached that verification stage. But these are the 6 projects in New Zealand so far. We've got 5 of them in Auckland. This one down here was in Wynyard Quarter, the Madden Pakenham upgrade. And then the McDougall's lift replacement at Cadrona Ski Fields. So it's pretty new, but it's definitely up and coming, and we're pretty excited about where it's going. And so this next slide here, if you wanted a really kind of clean cut, easy look at what is sustainability, this here is a really good table to reference, because it effectively takes all the areas that this tool looks at, which, to be fair, it's a very thorough and broad looking sustainability scheme. And so you've got, management, which includes the risk credits, but also things like commitments to sustainability, decision-making processes, inspections and audits, as well as procurement and purchasing. So those are kind of the more governance and management stuff. And then you move into climate change, resourcing, emissions. So this space is largely linked to the resource management side of things. So if you've got environmental compliance people in your organisation, the emissions, pollution and waste category is the one that has a lot of crossover with that area. And then ecology, and then you move into the social and cultural space, which has a lot of overlap with stakeholder professionals, and we do a lot of work with them as well. So anything else on that one? So in terms of the procurement stuff, that's something that I think we're seeing a lot of shifts in right now, and probably in the next 5 years, there'll be a lot of change because we're getting things like that lower embodied carbon in our materials. So zero concrete cement for concrete, reduced emissions in producing steel and things. Also, one of the things, like I said, around deconstruction rather than demolition. So that was something we were able to do on our project recently, is rather than going with the kind of standard go-to contractor who kind of smash and bash and get rid of it pretty quickly, pretty efficiently, but their waste is really high, the waste to landfill. We were able to open the tender and actually award a tender to a contractor who focuses on taking apart the property that we had to get rid of slowly and carefully. So it is a little bit slow, you know, it took them a week rather than 2 days. So if you've got that time to play with, that's not too bad. But they were able to take it apart slowly and carefully so that they could actually find new homes for the materials. So we had the underfloor, undercarpet layer had was able to go out to make gymnastics mats, and we had the flooring was able to be sold. And so the contractor can make money off all of those small wins, and therefore the contract that they charge the company for, so Watercare, was able to be cheaper. And that's a really fantastic business model, and also a way that when we're choosing our procurement, that's the kind of thing that we like to award and really try and encourage. And then a few other things that are likely to impact the procurement and supply chain side of things are the Modern Slavery Act. I know has been really prevalent in making change in Australia particularly, and also product stewardship. So the taking back the products at the end of the life. I know there's actually a plastics bill out at the moment, Eugenie Sage's bill, around the most kind of problematic types of plastic. So there's things like tires and takeaway packaging included in that. And so it's about how can the companies that produce these things start sort of taking responsibility and take them back at the end of their life to deal with them again, and try and come up with a beneficial reuse or something other than just filling up our landfills. So as I said, this is a really good overview of what sustainability looks like, particularly in infrastructure. And I thought I would just quickly run you through the risk credit, since I'm talking to risk professionals. There is an entire credit in the ISCA scheme. There's 44 total credits, and one of them is relating specifically to how projects address risk. So it's all a little bit wordy, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things. So when I said that we look at environmental, social and economic, and in New Zealand we do also add cultural into that. Australia hasn't quite caught up on that side of things, but this is kind of how it's woven in. So it's saying that the risk registers must include environmental, social and economic risks. So making sure that the project team has considered all of those elements. In addition to that, the risk registers or risk assessments need to be done at least once a year, as well as being done at key project phases. So that might be, you know, the beginning of construction, or the beginning of tunneling, or something like that. Those are obviously quite infrastructure specific examples, but making sure it's done at least once a year so it's kept up to date. Another thing is to, you know, that's level 1. So that level 1 is kind of BAU, slightly above. Level 2 moves up to New Zealand best practice or Australia best practice in either case. Which then includes going into your opportunities assessment. So have you thought about environmental, social and economic opportunities as well as just risk? And so some examples of economic opportunities that they've given here are things like providing local employment, supporting local businesses, things like social enterprises, increasing the city's productivity. And so for the CI project, a lot of that is also focused around how can we benefit people experiencing disadvantages. So we do have targets around growth for young people coming out of university, as well as Māori Pacifica people. So I thought this might be quite a useful slide perhaps, which is how would a risk professional assist with an ISCA risk credit? So if you were brought onto a project that's using ISCA, what would you do to maybe show that you know what you're talking about when it comes to this stuff, or that you could provide value? So a couple of things that from my experience I think would be really valuable. One is making sure that your risk registers have a separate column that says when each risk was entered into the register. So having dates rather than just a project phase, because this will allow your project to have evidence around demonstrating that it was done at least once a year. And kind of the example for this is in the CI, we've had design now since 2010. So it's been a long running project. And the risk registers were done at least once a month. My designers say they had so many risk meetings, but it wasn't always well recorded when they had these things. And so we provided, for our evidence for the submission, we provided agendas and meeting invites from their calendars, but they weren't minuted. And so because they weren't minuted, or they didn't have dates allotted to each risk that was entered into the register, we actually weren't able to get that credit. So it's very evidence-based, and it's very stringent, which I think is good because you're getting best practice. But that's something as a risk professional you can maybe consider, is making sure that that's done. And that may be best practice now, I'm not too sure. It's something obviously that was done over the last 10 years of practice, and maybe things have caught up a bit since then. Another thing is that often opportunities are talked about, but they're not always recorded. Particularly, you know, they might not get noted as things to follow up on or given actions to. And it can help drive opportunity implementation, especially if you've got the whole sort of multidisciplinary team present to provide different perspectives. It really fosters collaboration without necessarily them even knowing it. So getting opportunities put into the risk register, that was one of the first things that I did on this project. When I started being invited, I noticed there was no opportunities. And so that was something that we got done pretty quickly, because it just starts getting people thinking about that side of it as well, rather than just saying, oh, that's for the sustainability person to think about. You know, it's more broad and getting everyone's perspectives. And then another thing is making sure that they're thinking about all elements of sustainability. So often things like stakeholder and energy and materials are thought about because those are so easily associated with cost, you know, or program delays and things like that. But making sure that they're thinking about things like ecological enhancement opportunities, or what are the risks in terms of greenhouse gases, getting them to broaden their thinking around those kind of topics is really beneficial. And, you know, if you're not seeing it happen on, you know, risk registers you're working on, you could perhaps note it to demonstrate your diverse knowledge of sustainability and kind of show how you can add value in that space. So I kind of wanted to move into climate for a little bit, because I know this is such a hot topic, especially in the risk space. And I just wanted to highlight one thing that actually came out 2 or 3 weeks ago, towards the end of August. And it was around Ministry for the Environment putting out that they'll start to begin asking local authorities and lifeline utilities to make climate risk disclosures or climate change related disclosures from the end of September. So it's coming up pretty quick. So in terms of climate change risk disclosure, that's sort of, you know, you've assessed the vulnerabilities, you've implemented potential mitigations, or at least identified them, and adaptations as well as mitigation. And then what are your risks going forward? So organisations will be legally required to provide information on how they're responding to climate risks, including transitional risks, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So there's around 600 organisations which are made up of, like I said, lifeline utilities, so public and private sector places that provide fuel and electricity and water and transport, as well as telecommunications infrastructure as well, and then local authorities, so councils and things. So they'll all be required to report to the Minister on climate change, so Minister Shaw, on things like these 4 topics. So the organisation's governance in relation to the risks of and opportunities arising from climate change, the actual and potential effects of the risks and opportunities on the organisation's business, strategic and financial planning, the processes that the organisation uses to identify, assess and manage its climate change related risks, as well as the metrics and targets to that the organisation uses to assess and manage climate risks and opportunities, including things like timeframes and progress. So this information that all of the local authorities and lifeline utilities will provide will actually go towards the National Adaptation Plan, and that's what the government's currently preparing. So this is kind of one topical recent example that I just wanted to highlight the people on this call, because this is one of a long slew of climate-related disclosure, climate risk disclosure, things happening both globally and nationally. So this is kind of the most recent one, but there's a whole host of things going on in that space, and I expect that's the kind of thing that's front of mind for risk professionals with that kind of focus. And with that in mind, I thought I'd kind of just focus on a few different types of climate risks that, look, you might be well versed in this stuff already, but it's kind of bringing it from a water utilities point of view. So what are some of our major vulnerabilities or risks around climate, to put it in context? I always find it's helpful to have examples put to the theory rather than just sort of these general ideas that sometimes you struggle to connect with. So to compare the 2 different kinds of, or the 2 main types of climate risks, you've got physical things, which are what you think of a lot of the time in terms of, you know, drought from changing rainfall patterns. If we've got less dilution, then we're going to have concentrated wastewater flows, so you get more septic material in the sewers, which is a nice way of saying more poo, less water. You know, they might approach if it's yellow, let it mellow, and then you've got a higher concentration of nutrients in every flush. Then there's things like instability of dams from raising the water table, and saline intrusion in the pipes from inundation from sea level. All these kind of things that are happening physically. And then on the other side, you've got transitional risks. So the financial side of that is things like investing in stranded assets that, you know, you put in a large carbon footprint to build them, and then you might miss growth opportunities. So, you know, if you don't know where communities are going to be or not be, you might build an asset because it's needed, and then that area gets inundated. The whole community retreats or goes somewhere else, you know, they abandon that area, but you've put a $5 million pump station in there, which is now a total waste of money and a total waste of greenhouse gases. And that's an idea that is something really prevalent in climate science, is you don't want your adaptation measures to be detrimental to your mitigation. So we don't want to be, a good example actually is desalination plants. So they're a good answer to drought, right? You've got a lot of water in the sea, you can just suck it out, treat it, and you've got unlimited water to address the drought. But desalination plants you cannot underestimate how energy hungry they are. They really are incredibly energy intensive. And so a lot of that energy, it comes from either electricity, or in some cases it has to be diesel run, because a lot of the desal tech at the moment is coming from the Middle East. And so of course that is all kind of diesel focused. So that's another example where, you know, adaptation, desal looks like an amazing opportunity, but it's going to use so much energy that it's going to emit an insane amount of greenhouse gases. So it's completely detrimental to any mitigation targets you might have around climate change. So that's kind of an example of that. And then technological, so like the role of emerging technologies, if they have desal plants that are lower energy, or same with wastewater reuse, that's an area that would be lower energy than desal, still I think quite high, but we're still working on getting the technology in New Zealand, as well as we kind of have a legislative gap that doesn't enable or allow for potable wastewater reuse at the moment, which leads us into kind of policy and legal. And then another side of that is there are companies and governments globally that are being sued for climate inaction. And this is a huge risk. I mean, there's young people in the Netherlands that sued their government for climate inaction, and they won. They won that case. And I know that there's one going on in France at the moment with Total Energy is the company that's being sued. They're actually responsible for 1% of the world's emissions, which is pretty high for one company. So they're being sued as well at the moment for climate inaction. So that's that kind of policy and legal risk that I think is hugely important to boards and investors and shareholders. And then reputational risks. So this one I think is particularly prevalent with mitigation at the moment. So a lot of companies are now realizing that they need to keep up with what's going on. You know, there are companies that are going carbon neutral. I know a couple in New Zealand, we've got big ones like the Warehouse is carbon neutral, and Hell Pizza actually went carbon neutral just last week. And not to say that they're kind of perfect. I mean, a lot of that's done through offsetting, but it is really good in terms of leading the market. And there's a lot of companies now that are saying, okay, we should sign up to the Climate Leaders Coalition, look into science-based targets to reduce, you know, if you're not doing something around climate change in terms of acting to reduce your emissions, you're not doing it right. Actually, I know Microsoft has committed to going carbon negative, which is pretty world leading. I mean, I don't know anyone else that's doing that on their scale. So it's pretty impressive. And just for a kind of teaser, if you're interested in this kind of topic, Watercare does have a climate change mitigation and adaptation strategy. And my next slide touches on a few points that are in here, but there's a lot more detail in that in terms of those kind of risks, but more so in the physical space, because that is where a lot of our interest has to be. So what I've done here is I've actually just pulled out a bunch of examples of the vulnerabilities that our teams found when we were developing this strategy. So the strategy was done with a huge multidisciplinary team. We had people from construction and ops and stakeholder and risk and strategic planning and all sorts who, excuse me, went through all of the potential risks from the different climate change things. So thinking about the dry gets drier, the wet gets wetter, and the sea rises. So longer periods of drought followed by intense rainfall events over very short time frames, and then things like sea level rise. So these are just a few of the examples of that. Not all of them you'll see were physical or hard engineering based. We had things around consenting and resource management, morale, and reputational things. And through this, we really did realize that the easiest and cheapest place to address climate change is by putting a climate lens on your strategic planning and optioneering. And that has kind of given birth to the 40-20-20 enterprise model by getting carbon reduction brought into the early thinking of projects. This one here, I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but the third one along in the middle row, the dependency on third-party suppliers, that was one that continued to come up in every conversation we had. And it really highlights the need to work with other utilities and other suppliers, because we as Watercare, even though everyone depends on us for water, we're also dependent on those things. So we can't have roads that are flooded or, you know, rail that can't get chemical supplies to us. We need a constant supply of chemicals. We need telecom. We need power is a huge one to be able to run our plants, make sure our pump stations are working so that we don't end up with flooding and lack of service effectively. So that's a huge kind of thing. You know, if your ports are flooded from sea level rise or an intense extreme weather event with rain, and we can't get, for example, one of our chemicals or one of the things we need to run our organisation, we're really, really vulnerable. And so that's a huge risk to us, and one that we're really working on to try and ensure that the companies that we're dependent on are also working through their climate risk vulnerabilities and making sure that they're improving their resilience. So that's, I guess, one of our forms of resilience is making sure everyone we depend on is also resilient. And then another thing is around board interest, board leadership, kind of taking the charge. So this was brought into one of our strategic priorities at Watercare quite a while ago now, to be fully sustainable. So that was kind of an early commitment, and we're like, okay, this is how we want to be, this is what we want our decision making to be based on, so let's bring that to the forefront. And that's the kind of thing, alongside our board and senior leadership being really interested and really committed to sustainability, that has allowed us to have the commitments around, for example, 40-20-20, or we have commitments for 2 of our largest wastewater plants to be energy neutral by 2025. Those kinds of world-leading practices are really enabled by the board and senior leadership being so on board, I guess, or so interested and excited. One of our board members has actually started heading a subcommittee of our board, which addresses climate-related matters. So looking at the strategy, how's it being implemented, how are we improving our resilience to climate-related risks? And kind of having that mandate from the top means that people are really excited and interested to get involved in these projects because they're seeing it as really future focused and something that they can maybe sink their teeth into and be involved in the way of the future effectively. So in this way, sustainability is kind of about going above compliance and putting in a bit of extra effort. So we've got the compliance environmental, you know, under the RMA, we've got that pretty well down. So now what's the next level of bringing it up? And I think that's what the board's particularly interested in. It's really good for kind of reputation as well. If you're a private company, being able to demonstrate this is what we're doing. We are leading this industry. We are excited about it, you know. Particularly, I know one of the hot topics right now is around alternative fuel sources or fuel efficiency for trucks and cars and vehicles and things. What else was there? So it's in its infancy in New Zealand still, as I said, with potentially mandating sustainability. I don't think our industry is quite ready for that yet. You know, when you look at subcontractors and their ability to deliver on the things that we're asking for in terms of, you know, for this ISCA rating, we're required to measure and collect the data for every litre of diesel and fuel that we use. So that's every car, excavator, trucks that move our spoil. That's a huge piece of work, and it's not necessarily something that the subcontractors have had to do before. So it's a whole new way of working for them. It's asking quite a bit more of them. So that's an area that I think our supply chain can start to maybe build, because I do think that this is the direction of the industry, and we're seeing it come into legislation. We're seeing the board be really interested and committed to it. So I think that's something that is worth companies like that, particularly with social procurement as well. That's going to be one of the next big focuses, I think, in ensuring that we're not supporting child slavery or anything like that. And I also just wanted to finish on one of the big topics around climate risk assessment and adaptation with the boards and investors, particularly of private companies, things like banks and Westpac, and BlackRock was one, and I'm not sure if everyone will be familiar with BlackRock. I think they have something like $5 trillion worth of investment, but they, in 2017, I think it was, they put out a thing where they demanded demonstrable fluency from the directors of their companies that they invest in when it comes to climate risk. So they want people to be able to demonstrate that they are resilient, and that's a huge factor, because if you're ignoring climate change and you're not addressing that risk, it's going to kind of come eventually. And they want to see people being really adaptable and addressing mitigation to try and lessen its effects. So I thought that was a really impactful statement, the demonstrable fluency, and seeing that level of investor who's so influential and so huge, having that kind of influence. So I think that's probably a pretty good point to finish on. Keen to take any questions that you might have around sustainability or climate risk, anything like that. There's no questions yet, so if you've got any, pop them up and we can just hold out for a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I hope this was useful in terms of an understanding of what sustainability is, how it looks, what sustainability professionals do and focus on, as well as maybe giving a few handy hints on if you're going to be working on a project that sustainability is a focus on, you know, how can you kind of demonstrate your knowledge of sustainability. And I think it's something that impresses people, you know, when you start talking about these things, it is that next level up. And so taking it above BAU and showing that this is something you're interested in, I think is really quite valuable. So I hope that was useful to you all. And, oh, I've seen a question pop up. So it says, good to see third-party vendors included. How does Watercare assess these vendors' programs for environmental sustainability and climate risk? That's a really good question. So in terms of, I can speak to the CI quite easily, which is my project. So when we're addressing contractors and subcontractors, our contractor is required with all of their procurement to assess the sustainability value of each opportunity or each tender or bidder. So that's a really big focus. But in terms of the dependencies, so the telco, the power, the chemicals, that's a journey that we are, I guess, in the early stages of. So we have a Lifeline Utilities group that meets, I think it's either monthly or bi-monthly, and they meet to discuss these kind of matters and share their climate risk portfolios, I guess, or strategies. I do think this is something that's in its early stages and definitely needs to be developed more, but it is one of our portfolios and our climate strategies. So it's something that it has an owner, it has someone who's managing it, and still kind of identifying who are all the people, where are they up to, how often do we meet with them. So yeah, I think that's something that probably 1 year from now we could give a slightly more detailed description of what we've done to address these kind of things. For now, it's probably still in its early stages. Oh, I see we've got some coming through on the chat as well. Question was, is the CI project completed? What are the lessons learnt with respect to sustainability? So the CI is not completed, no. So we've actually been in construction just gone a year now, and construction's not scheduled to be finished till probably about 2026. I say that because it's just been extended, so our time frame or program will get extended a little bit. But in terms of lessons learnt, I can give a couple for the design of the CI. So one is make sure sustainability is considered as early as possible. Once you've made some of the key decisions, you're quite locked in and your ability to influence change reduces. So they brought me on as the first sustainability person on the project in 2018. So they were just tendering and design had just closed. And I came in and I was like, right, how are we going to reduce concrete, reduce steel? And they were like, no, design's done. That's done. So I think that has been something that I've been able to do, but a lot of my job now is more around how can we address on-site changes? So how can we reduce fuel for our spoil haul? How can we better work with our stakeholders? How can we improve ecology? So if a sustainability person had been brought on at the beginning of the project, it couldn't have been me because in 2010 I was still in high school. But if they brought someone like that in early, then they might have been able to make bigger picture changes. So I would consider that probably one of the biggest lessons learnt. Got a couple of questions coming through. Can you tell us about how you got senior management commitment for the initiatives? That's an interesting one, and one that I think would be quite hard without senior leaders who are already fairly flexible or on board with these kind of thinking. So our project director, Shane Kunis, and our CEO, Raveen Jadaram, they're both pretty committed to doing what's right, doing the best option. And as soon as we got sustainability on the project, that was our kind of commitment. And they were kind of keen that we hit the ground running and get things going. What I will say is that, you know, I'm not going to get sign off for any sustainability initiative just because I say it's good, right? I've got to be able to prove that it's worth the spend, that there's you know, significant value to be made out of this, whether that's in cost savings and efficiency or program improvement, or whether it's around doing better for our communities. So an option might be less noisy and less dusty, like the deconstruction. So not only is it cheaper in this case and the right thing to do, but it also means that we're being better neighbours to our stakeholders rather than being, you know, crash, bash, noisy kind of neighbours. So being able to think about not only does this work from my point of view, and I'm keen on anything that reduces greenhouse gases, so I'm like, great, let's do it. But what other factors can you think about to sell it to your project director to make them kind of understand that it's really worthwhile from multiple perspectives. If you can equate it to cost savings, that's always a big benefit. And some of those costs might not be direct, but it might be things like, I think we're going to have, you know, happier neighbours that aren't going to make claims or, you know, worry about us with the council, those kind of things. Do we use surveys or questionnaires for vendors to complete? I'm not sure if vendors you're talking about tenderers for our contracts or our third-party dependencies. Tenderers, yes, we do. We have pre-qualification surveys around sustainability for my project at least. Vendors, in terms of those third-party dependencies, I don't know if we do yet. I admit that's not the area that I work in. It's not my portfolio, but I do think that's probably quite a good idea, quite like it. So I could chat with the people here, and you're welcome to get in touch with me directly if you'd like, and I can help chat through and put you in touch with the right people. Quick question, how have you created a sense of urgency in your senior leadership to practically integrate sustainability risks into your strategic risk management conversations, especially with the national focus being fairly slow to push through the practical adoption? Interesting question. I think one of the ways is we had the right people doing the work. So we've had a great couple of sustainability managers, Rosalind Klein and Chris Thurston, who have been really good at showing what's happening globally and also showing slow triggers or slow burn of that national guidance and say, we want to be ahead of this. We're a huge user of energy through our wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants. So we want to be on the forefront and really be seen to be leading this thing. You know, we need to make change. So I think having staff that can demonstrate that is really valuable. But also we did have a couple of board members who were quite interested. You know, we had them asking us, what about science-based targets? Have we thought about that? Those kind of things. So I do think that was quite valuable. In terms of a sense of urgency, it could probably be done in different ways. Perhaps in a public company, a private company, you might want to say, well, we want to be cutting edge, we want to be ahead of the competition. So, you know, we need to do it soon because otherwise someone else will. And we want to have that leading edge to do better than the others effectively. I guess that's probably a good answer to that one. Hang on, I've gotten a bit lost. There's a lot of questions coming through. You're right in the national focus being fairly slow to push it through. The climate change bill was not quite as punchy as I would have liked personally. And so creating that sense of urgency, I guess this sounds like a bit of a weak answer, but in some ways it's quite easy for us as a lifeline utility, because you've got to say, okay, we know it's happening, this is a bloody big risk for us, and we need to be able to provide clean water and wastewater services to our people. We can't have that threatened. So because we're a lifeline utility, that enables us that sense of urgency quite easily. But I do think that's probably applicable to a lot of companies. You know, you can say, we need to make sure that we keep going, we address these risks. You know, you've got so much out there around, you know, Obama saying climate change is the biggest issue that we're going to face in this lifetime and all these things. So I think that sense of urgency is there. It's maybe just guiding your senior leadership to it if you feel as though they're not quite there, and showing them this is a huge risk for us. We need to be on top of that, particularly when both shareholders and investors on the public or private side and government on the public side is really demanding climate risk disclosure and an understanding of your climate risks. I've made reference to how organisations need to take action to address these risks. Would I be able to elaborate on the role of assurance and where they should or could be focusing to support? Possibly, but I will admit that risk and assurance is not my area of expertise. At least I can tell you what Watercare's done. So we had a climate change team, which was not a team that was given a mandate or anything like that. It wasn't part of our KPIs or job description, but it was a multidisciplinary team. There was 5 of us who were brought together by the sustainability manager, who she was an island to herself. And we were people who wanted to make change, wanted to be involved in this kind of work. And she brought us together. I was in planning at the time and resource management. We had an engineer, we had a policy person, brought them together to put together the strategy. And then that's become much wider. And so risk was involved in assessing, or our risk team, I should say, was involved in assessing the vulnerabilities at that level. But perhaps the role of assurance in terms of focusing support would be either to start the conversation if it's not happening, or if it is happening, support your sustainability or environmental or whoever it is, even if it's your team, support them and make sure that people within the organisation know that it actually is part of their job description, because it's part of everybody's. It's going to be a huge part of our future, but also it's a really cool opportunity for them to show within their professional development, you know, having these kind of experiences is going to be really valuable and shows that you are kind of up for the task. So maybe that's a way in terms of focusing your support, is making sure that enough people are getting on board. People aren't being kind of laggards or being difficult. But also I do think the risk teams or risk professionals are quite well regarded by the board and senior leadership. You know, the board and senior leadership look to the risk people to say, is this an all right option? How are we doing? I do think you guys hold quite a lot of power in that way. And that's something that perhaps I think having an ability to show your knowledge on this space and thinking through all the opportunities, all the risks of climate change might really help to support what might be happening through the environmental or sustainability lens, because sometimes those avenues can be seen as, you know, the hippies or the blue skies thinking. So if you've got the risk people backing it up and saying, oh yeah, they're right, this is a really big problem and we need to address it, I do think those two teams coming together is actually really powerful. And I do think we should probably leave it there. So I'll pass on back to Risk New Zealand and finish up here.
Hey, thanks, Olivia. That was a great presentation. We learned so much from that. I didn't know there was so much in sustainability. Thank you. Look, I'll take the opportunity to say thank you and everything we've learned today, and also we'll send Olivia a Risk New Zealand corporate gift for all her work. So that's great stuff. Hey, look, thanks to everyone for making the time to join us. And if you have more questions, and I see there's a lot of interest there, please send them through. We'll forward them to Olivia and look, she'll answer from there because it's been very popular. Look, just again, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this all possible. That's Marsh, Safety Associates, ISCA Global, KPMG, Navigatus, Christchurch City Council, PowerCo, and of course, Watercare. Please check our mailers for upcoming events. There's a few on, and even next month, we've got 2 lunchtime seminars as we kind of start the wrap up towards Christmas, and they're very good too. So details on those soon. If you aren't already a member of Risk New Zealand, we'd love to have you join us. And if you know anyone else who'd like to join, please forward their names through or please get them to join up, and we're always happy to chat. Jump on the website or just send an email to www.risknewzealand.org.nz and we'll get in touch with you. I think that's the website anyway. We'd like to cater to all our members and potential members. If there are any topics or speakers you have in mind, please get in touch by email and we'll be more than happy to have a bit of a chat about your ideas. This webinar has also been recorded and we'll send out to you in the next couple of days. So thanks everyone for being here. We look forward to seeing you again at more events and activities at Risk New Zealand. Have a great day.